Hello, Public Econ students, and welcome to Module 2. As I did last week, I just wanted to send out a brief video to kind of go over some of the things that we'll be discussing this week in this module in particular, and some of the important sort of deadlines and things to pay attention to during this module. So during Module 2, the only thing that we do have to do is that discussion board. I want to take a brief make a brief note on the discussion boards here. So they are due, your initial post, as almost all of you met this, are due on Friday evenings. And your response to someone else's post is due on Sunday evening, 11:59 p.m. in both cases. This is done in order to allow respondents time to go over the initial posts and decide which posts they want to respond to, and then, think about those responses. I have not yet had a chance to go over your posts. I am planning to do that today, finishing up tomorrow at the very, very latest, hopefully today. I don't respond to every single person's post every single week. What I set out to do each semester, each time I teach this course, is to respond to each of you 2 or 3 times throughout the semester. And so I kind of keep track of who I've already responded to, and kind of try to provide some responses to your posts at least a few times throughout the semester. So if I don't respond to you this week, it doesn't mean I don't think that your post was fantastic, or that, I learned something from it. I will say, one of my absolute favorite things about teaching this class is that I really do learn a tremendous amount from your posts. I read each of the things that I've posted for you to read. Most of these things I've read numerous times. Certainly this week's content on public goods and externalities, I've read these things numerous times, and I'm always amazed at the insight students lend, the perspective that y'all lend to these issues. So I will be grading these. I'll respond to a few of you this week. I'll respond to a few others of you next week. And I will provide grades certainly by tomorrow at the very latest. So this week we are going over public goods, public services, and externalities. It's the content, the subject of this week's content. And so really the reason that I put this particular week in the readings, public economics is such a broad field. It was really, really difficult for me to sort of whittle down exactly what I wanted to include in the readings, what topics I wanted to include in the readings for y'all and the discussions for you. I thought it was extremely important to include public goods, public services, and externalities for, I think, reasons that you'll see are obvious as you're reading this. But one of the key things that I hope comes across in these readings is that very, very often, public goods are sort of thought of one of the reasons for government to do the things they do. Last week we read stuff on, what is the role of government in the economy. Well, one of the big things, when we think about what the role of the government should be, we think about providing, national defense, providing police services, and providing some limited public goods and services. Is sort of the minimalist version of, what government should be doing. And then there are all sorts of different, versions of what government should be doing beyond those things. But looking at public goods, even the, sort of most minimalist person thinking about government would say, well, government should provide some public goods. The question becomes, well, what sorts of public goods, to what extent should they be providing public goods, and very critically, should government be the provider of these public goods and services just because markets are currently failing to provide those services or not providing them to the extent that we think are socially optimal in some broad sense. And so I think that's a really, really big question, and sometimes the answer to that question is no. I think some of these readings cover that. Sometimes the answer to that question is no, because we need to have parallel assumptions when we're thinking about the provision of public goods and services and what government should and shouldn't do. Very often the argument is made, markets have failed in this area. Let's turn to government to provide that public good or provide that public service. But we don't often step back and think, is government able to adequately or appropriately provide that good or service as well? Markets fail, yes. Governments fail too. And so having those parallel assumptions when we're thinking about whether markets or governments should be providing something is really, really important, so that we make sure that we are using public funds appropriately. You know, public funds and the time of public servants is also a scarce resource. And so dedicating time and energy and resources to solving one sort of policy problem can sometimes distract from solving other, perhaps more important policy problems. And so thinking through the sorts of public goods and services that government should provide and in what cases they should provide them is really, really crucially important. One other point that I want you all to really take note of in this week is the distinction between pecuniary and non-pecuniary externalities. So one of the key reasons that we think that perhaps government should step in to, again, not always necessarily the case, but one of the arguments that government should step in to correct problems of the market is when there are these externality problems, costs that are imposed on third parties that aren't directly, privy to a particular market transaction. And so, that's a traditional defense of government activity is to solve or at least mitigate some of these externality problems. This is very clear when we talk about non-pecuniary externalities, the sort of textbook examples of externalities. But the Holcomb and Sobel piece discusses the importance of thinking this through with respect to non-pecuniary externalities. So all of these pieces kind of flow together in that way. And that's the uniting thread that I see, or at least I saw when I was putting together these readings. I love teaching this class because maybe you see something different in these readings than I saw, and that's fantastic. So again, to reiterate, the only thing you have to do this week is the discussion board, but I do want you to start thinking critically about your final paper. This is a very accelerated course, and so getting started early on that final paper is really important. Next week, you'll have your paper proposal due, and that's really just to get you, started thinking and be able to have me give you some feedback to make sure that your paper is headed in a viable direction, and maybe I can push you into thinking about, some of the complications or opportunities that your particular paper presents. So that's all I've got for this week. As always, feel free to shoot me an email if you have any questions. I'm always happy to hop on a quick Zoom call if you have any other questions. Otherwise, I will read over your posts throughout today, and certainly by tomorrow you'll have grades back. Thanks, everyone.